Welcome to Making an Impact. I'm Katie Mills, the head of Zygo Power at Schneider Electric, and in this podcast, we meet incredible individuals from a range of industries to discuss the exciting projects that they're involved with today, their career journey to date, and ultimately what impact their work is having on the world. In this episode, we're making an impact with John Keane, CEO of SolarAid. Having moved to rural Tanzania over 20 years ago, he was blown away by the level of inequality in the world. Since then, he has devoted his professional career to changing this unacceptable reality. We'll take a look at how developing long-term sustainable infrastructure can aid communities in developing nations and how they are overcoming challenges both short-term and long-term. So welcome, John, to Making an Impact.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
No, so great to have you. So, John, SolarAid. Tell us a little bit about SolarAid and what it does.
Sure. Well, SolarAid was set up in 2006 with two clear goals, which is to fight poverty and the climate crisis. And we do that by enabling communities, households, schools, clinics to access solar-powered electricity across rural sub-Saharan Africa.
Awesome. And so tell me a little bit about what does SolarAid do differently? How do you engage the kind of local community? What's different about the way that you do it?
Sure. And well, look, SolarAid has always been a very practical organization. We were actually established by an entrepreneurial solar company called Solar Century. And we always basically believed in business-based solutions and really not relying on handouts and free giveaways, but more on developing a trade, not aid approach. And that's really important because what we're trying to achieve is not just access to electricity, for example, in a rural health center, but long-term sustainable access. And so we have been working for the last 18 years. A lot has happened over those 18 years, but essentially we've been working to catalyze and stimulate the development of solar markets across sub-Saharan Africa. And then that means not just providing access to solar products, and we're not just driving around giving products away for free, but actually working and training and supporting the development of solar entrepreneurs who can work with their rural communities and be there for the long term. Rather than treating somebody as a beneficiary, they're more as a customer. And then if they're a customer, they have the right to good customer service. And you have to ensure that you provide good quality customer service. And that means you need the infrastructure to provide that service. And that will be in the form of a rurally based solar entrepreneur. So it's quite a big infrastructure. And when you're developing a marketplace, it's quite a lot of work. But that's what we do. And so we don't want, and the market that we've been working to help kickstart across the continent is not reliant on SolarAid as a charity being there. So, we can stimulate demand and trust in solar products. We can help build the infrastructure to provide access to those solar products and solar solutions. But then ultimately, we should then be able to take a step back and it continues on without us.
Got it. And so I'm hearing that you like a challenge because you work in rural Africa, which, that not only are you working in rural parts, but you're also working in developing nations, which obviously have their own kind of challenges. What are some of the challenges that you see as kind of huge hurdles when it comes to, overcoming access to energy, let's say, in some of these more rural areas and also in developing nations?
Well, sure. Well, look, as I said at the beginning, we've established to fight poverty and build resilience to the climate crisis. And so what you've got across much of rural sub-Saharan Africa is lack of electricity. The electricity grid does not go into the deep rural areas. So you've got the majority of people living without that access. And so, that really ties your hands behind your back if you're trying to build a rural economy. Imagine in the UK, if 80% of people didn't have access to electricity, imagine what that would do to the GDP and the level of income levels across the country. So that's the significant challenge. So if you can overcome the energy access barrier and enable people to have access to reliable electricity, then you are a far better placed to build a stronger life, build your way out of poverty, and build resilience to the climate crisis. Now, I mentioned the climate crisis because essentially, sub-Saharan Africa is not the part of the world that's generating all the carbon and the CO2 that's led to the climate crisis. But they very much are at the forefront of feeling the impacts of the climate crisis. And what I mean by that is the majority of people and communities living across sub-Saharan Africa are smallholder farmers. And many are reliant on the rainfall patterns. They have seasonal rainfall patterns. And what we've been seeing over the last 10, 15 years is unreliable rainfall patterns. So whether or not it's drought or flooding, they're the things that hit the headlines. But actually, unreliable rain can also lead to crops failing, and then a lot of insecurity in terms of whether or not it's income, if people are selling their crops, or actually just food on the table. And so they're real challenges. And so that actually traps people because they're just living season to season. And it's really hard then to strengthen your rural economies if you're actually facing that crisis. They're two key things that we're facing. There are many others. There's the rural infrastructure, the roads going into many rural areas virtually disappear during the rains. These are not tarmac roads. These are mud roads. And so when you've got heavy rains, they can turn into rivers. And so then it's actually very hard. And so people become then quite isolated, and it's hard to provide services in those deep rural areas. And so there's many challenges when you're working across these rural environments.
It sounds to me, kind of listening to you talk, obviously access to energy is a real foundational element when it comes to these rural economies, right? In many, many ways. And then also, I think what's really interesting to hear when I hear you talk is, most people in our part of the world, I'm in the UK, think of the climate crisis of, it's going to be a bit hotter next year. Great, wonderful,
Sure.
bit more sun for us in London. But actually what we forget about, right, is the very real impacts that it puts on other parts of, the globe that are already dealing with huge challenges. And poverty is obviously a real issue there. I hadn't ever really, I suppose I hadn't really thought about the climate crisis keeping people in poverty. But from what you're saying, like, that's a real threat, right? So how do we help overcome that? Not just as a country or as an economy, but like as a human race, right? We're all part of the same, human race.
Well, that's it, right? Well, it's a complex problem, but you're right. We tend to talk about the climate crisis as something that's going to happen in the future if we don't get our CO2 emissions, below a certain level. Whereas actually it's happening right now, and again, we see it in the headlines. We saw in Spain earlier the year, the floods and the catastrophic, weather events that take place, droughts, flooding, cyclones. But the day-to-day impact on rainfall patterns across sub-Saharan Africa is sort of your continual day-to-day challenge. And so if you're a rural farmer and say, for example, in Zambia, you don't know when the rain season is going to start. And if it starts, you don't know if it's going to continue. Will it just rain for a week and then stop? When do you plant your crops? And once you could get through most of the season and then the rains just stop early. And so then it really puts people in vulnerable position. So what do you do about that? Well, obviously, I'm from the UK too. We all have to try and do what we can to reduce our climate emissions. Absolutely. But I think from a SolarAid perspective, we are working directly with the rural communities to enable them to have access to electricity so that they can build resilience. So, whether or not that's extending the working day with a simple solar-powered light, whether or not it's electricity to power a rural business, or it's electricity to power a rural irrigation pump, which then makes people are less reliant then on unpredictable rainfall patterns. There's a range of different interventions that we can work with, but basically the premise is enable access to electricity, provides many opportunities then to tackle the challenge at a local rural level.
And absolutely. And I suppose the question that it kind of leads to, really, from my perspective then, is finance, right? These things cost money. Sustainable finance, is it out there? Does it exist? And I suppose kind of what roles can other organizations, whether it's NGOs or whether it's government entities, play in helping develop that real kind of financial mechanism?
Well, it's a really good question. There's probably a very long answer to that. But I would say, well, first of all, we work together with customers. And so customers pay for what you're providing. Now, there's different models there. There's one, there's a retail model. We have a solar light. Would you like to buy it? Now, if you go back 20 years, solar lights as we know them now and solar home systems didn't really exist, or if they did, they were very, very expensive. And so they were just simply too expensive. That's the first thing. So what we've been working with and what's been happening over the last 10, 15 years is the price of solar has gone down significantly. And the price of solar products, which have lithium-based batteries inside and LEDs, light-emitting diodes inside, they've become far more efficient than they were 10, 15 years ago. So what you can actually provide in terms of a product at a price point has changed dramatically over the last 15 years. So that's the first thing to say. So, working to bring the price point down. Then the second then is, I suppose, there have been breakthroughs with technology which enables people to buy products in installments. That's the rent-to-own, pay-as-you-go model. And so that's been great for enabling rural households, especially to access or purchase solar home systems in installments, say over a 2-year period. It's not without its own challenges because there is a cost of finance and there is a risk associated with providing that product in installments. And so that actually increased the overall price. But then ultimately, the poorest people really struggle to afford a retail price or a rent-to-own price. And so then what do you do then? And that's the limit of a marketplace. You can either give away for free, you could work with subsidy, and that subsidy used to be a dirty word in about 10 years ago in the pico solar industry, as we call it, the small solar industry across sub-Saharan Africa, because we didn't want to harm a market when we were trying to develop it by flooding it with subsidy. But now what we've seen is the marketplaces, it's reaching a certain percentage, the people who've got a bit more money, people are able to access solar products and solar lights and systems. But the poorest 20, 30% of our population are really being left behind. They just can't afford what's on offer. And so what we're working with is, there's access to finance for entrepreneurs. So that's one thing, is like, an entrepreneur who's working in a rural area, they need to have stock and they need to be able to afford to have stock levels at a certain level to make it financially viable, economy of scale. So we've set up something called FEBCO, which is a finance cooperative in Malawi that is enabling the entrepreneurs to come together and access basically microfinance. So they can actually build stock levels so they can actually supply. But what I'm talking about really is the customer access to finance. And what we're doing now is working with what we call an energy as a service model. And that is essentially no longer requiring a customer to purchase hardware in order to access the electricity it provides. And so that's where we're basically instead, in the poorest communities, we're installing solar home systems. They've got multiple lights, they've got phone charging, they can power radios. We can install them for free on a rural household. The household does not own them. It's essentially infrastructure providing access to energy. And all they have to do is pay a small fee to access for a day or a week's amount of energy. That's kind of like how you and I access our own electricity. We do not own the electricity grid. We pay our bills. And this is essentially taking away the burden of requiring people to own hardware in order to access basic electricity. And that's really interesting. And so that's what we're really pushing at the moment. And in one of the poorest parts of Malawi, we're aiming to achieve 100% access in Kasakula, which is a traditional authority area, by next year. And that's going to be, we hope, transformational. So if you went there 2 years ago, you may have seen maybe 10% of people had access to a solar light or home system. If you go there today, it's at about 50% because of the work we've been doing. And by next year, we're aiming for 100%. And so that by doing that and learning together with communities what it takes to enable people to have a connection, then that's a key thing that SolarAid does. We want to demonstrate, learn, do the hard stuff, and then work together with governments, NGOs, private sector on developing roadmaps to scale. And so that's kind of what we're really focused on. I know that's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's awesome. And it kind of leads leads me to my next question around skills, right? I think it's a pretty well-known stat, right, that there is a very high youth population across Africa. And I think, if you look at some of the work that's being done around COP, around this, there was a lot of research done that, people expected positive economic growth because you had such a large younger population, right? Who were, open to the workforce and had a long kind of career in front of them. That hasn't been the case, right? It hasn't led, like, unemployment has remained relatively stable in the sense that it's, pretty much the same rate. Where do you see from your experience the gap, right? That you have a very young population, rife for employment, but you still have high levels of unemployment in that. Like, where is that gap? And I suppose, how can renewable energy maybe act as a way of plugging that gap, shall we say?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I think this is all around investment. So if you think about it, what we're really doing is encouraging investment in electricity generation in rural areas. And so there's different sides to this. So the first is, we work with rural entrepreneurs and we support them, provide business skill trainings, etc., to provide that access to the solar light or the electricity. And that's also even if you're providing it, well, instead of selling solar products, you could, the energy as a service model is basically a customer service function. So again, we do more training there. So you can basically create green jobs by providing access to solar powered light and electricity in rural areas. But the second thing, and obviously one of the reasons we're providing or working to provide this access, is to improve quality of life. And what can you do with that electricity? And that in itself creates opportunities for, jobs, whether or not that's, a farmer irrigating their crops, or it's, somebody keeping their shop open, charging mobile phones. Mobile phones are huge, by the way. I mean, obviously they've transformed the world, but absolutely they've transformed sub-Saharan Africa. Increasingly, people have access to mobile phones or even smartphones, at least at village level, and then that provides access to the global community at large. And so that's, for example, really important for farmers. If they're growing rural crops, how do they know what the market price is if they don't have access to that information? Phones have enabled that, but you have to keep the phone on, and you have to have access to turning that phone on, and that's where, again, access to electricity is vital. So in a nutshell, access to electricity in rural areas creates opportunity for green jobs, but then also the jobs that are created as a result of having that access.
Absolutely. And I've seen, as well across that region, that phones are given access to economies, right? To currency and trade, because, they are using phones like for M-Pesa a lot. And, without those kind of things, that was, trade was a lot harder, right? There wasn't that kind of currency exchange going on.
Absolutely.
Coming back to SolarAid, a couple of questions around some of the projects, I suppose, that you've worked on as SolarAid. One of them being the Lighter Village project. And I just wanted to understand that a little bit from your perspective, because for me, looking at it and doing my research, it looks like, obviously there is the element of technology, but it's very much about community and affordable finance models. So kind of just keen to understand that project from your perspective.
Well, yeah, sure. Look, as I said, SolarAid, we've had different versions of SolarAid over the years because we're agents of change. So what you had 18 years ago is, small solar lights and home systems felt like a really good idea. They just didn't exist. And so let's help make them exist. And then it's like, well, now they need to get into the hands of people. Let's stimulate a marketplace. And so people have access. So, that was stage 2, if you will. Then stage 3 is, well, hang on, not everyone is joining this solar revolution. Why not? Let's work with the communities and understand what the challenges that need to be overcome to enable everyone to have access. And that's essentially where Lighter Village came from. It was basically recognizing that the solar products exist and there are retail markets providing access. Solar entrepreneurs exist to provide access, but there's a huge gap and there's still a significant percentage of a rural population basically not gaining access. And so we basically set our mission really is essentially, how can we enable 100% of a population have access. That's the mission in a nutshell. And if you look at it in percentage terms, we're way off. You're maybe getting 20 or 30% of people maybe getting access. So then we sat down with the communities and we said, well, look, what can we do to overcome this challenge? And we looked at all the different models that we've worked with over the years. And this is where Lighter Village, with a common goal together with the community, was, okay, let's try and reach 100% together. And we realized the way to do that in that particular community was to provide energy as a service, which is essentially you can rapidly install solar home systems on every single home in that community. You can just install it for free. Say, look, we are installing this. You do not own it. You just basically are signing up to accepting this product within your home. So that all of a sudden there's no risk for that customer. They're not being asked to, like with a mortgage, you put your down payment and then you got to stay with your mortgage rates, otherwise you might lose your home. That's essentially what rent to own models across the continent have been doing. You've got to keep up with your payments, otherwise you will take back that product. We did this differently. We said, well, look, we are installing this. This is a connection, just like you or I, KT, will have access to the electricity grid. And if we don't pay the bill, okay, you don't get electricity. But then as soon as you start paying again, you have access again. It's not like there's a big barrier to gaining access. It's you can just pay a small amount and you can turn your light on again. So that's what we did. We said, well, look, we will work with this community to install solar home systems on every single household. And then the deal is basically, well, the objective was that everyone starts using them and starts paying to use them. And then let's see what happens. Now, the other important thing to say is we worked, this is a customer community-centric approach in the terms of we didn't just set the price and say, right, well, for this to be a sustainable business model, you have to pay $1 a day. Otherwise, this thing doesn't work. Instead, we worked with the community and said, okay, what is affordable here? What are you paying, for example, for a candle? Oh, it's a few cents. Okay, let's work on a pricing point that we believe everybody can afford. And so the objective being high, I suppose, penetration rates, 100%, high usage rates, high payment rates, and then working at the back end saying, right, how do we make this business model stack up? Does it need subsidy? What kind of financing would it need? Is it blended finance? But not worrying too much at the outset about answering those questions. Obviously, we put a business model together. We have assumptions, but it really is about, number one is, does this work for the rural customer? Is that community now transformed? And just to say, so we're at 50% at the moment, and we're aiming for 100% by next year. The really interesting thing that happened was we installed 500 systems a couple of years ago, and then the rural schools basically approached us and said, the education authorities approached us and said, can we be part of this, please? Because this was a household-focused project. And they saw the systems we were using for households, and they said, we want those in the schools. Can you treat us as a customer too? And so we realized that we could. And so we said, okay, exactly the same deal. And so now we're working with 12 schools as well. And so it was a very nice organic development. And so that's kind of what we're doing. And I suppose the other thing I would say is, obviously, I mentioned earlier that when you're providing energy as a service, you are providing a service to rural customers. That means, they are paying for that service. That means you have to be able to provide customer care. So we've recruited and trained customer service representatives from each location who are from the communities, and they're there to ensure that systems remain operational, payments go through, and the whole thing runs smoothly. So we're learning as we go, but it's been pretty successful so far, and so much so that actually the government in Malawi are now discussing with us the potential for this to be scaled up across the whole district. So so at the moment, I'll give you figures. We started with 500 systems. We're now at over 4,000 systems. Our goal is 8,813 systems for that traditional authority area. But if we scale to a district level, you're going 10 times that. You're about 80,000. And so that's a really important next step for us to work with the government to develop a plan as to how we can achieve that together with partners. Now, again, we don't want this to be reliant on SolarAid. So the next phase is, okay, which partners are needed and which entities are needed to take this to the next level. And if we can scale at district level, then you've got a really strong case study to show the rest of the continent this has been made possible, and here's how we did it. And it was in one of the poorest countries, in one of the poorest parts of that country. And so that's sort of it's, in a way, it's the domino effect. If we can get this and really crack how to do this, then it's something that we can share and others can start to replicate in other parts of the continent.
Absolutely. That sounds awesome. Like, yeah, super, super interesting to hear the uptake and kind of, how it's really community led, right? And yeah. I suppose what I find interesting to hear is how you have to make the business model fit the environment rather than, the other way around, which, sometimes there's a tendency to do the other way around. Like, we've got to make money from this, so we've got to look like X. But actually, what you're saying is that doesn't work all the time.
Well, that's it. So in a way, that's been done, right? It's like the market is, and it's great. The market exists and it's serving a certain population, but not everybody. And the other thing, I think the important thing to say is, and this is why we're not shy about it, we're saying if this model needs subsidy, okay, at least we'll know how much subsidy is needed. This is long-term access again. This is long-term access. It's not like for a year. We're modeling over a decade and more. But I would say these are communities that are struggling and they're feeling the brunt of the climate crisis. Now, there are obviously the Green Climate Fund has been developed for a reason, where developed nations are contributing to a Green Climate Fund. And so now where should that money go? There's many places that money could go. But if we can demonstrate by providing access at this rural level actually has a significant impact in building resilience to the climate crisis, then sure enough, there's subsidy to enable this model to get started. But I would say it's a one-off subsidy. The goal is that basically the capex gets covered and the operational expenditure comes through from the income generated from the model itself. So in a way, this is just a one-off subsidy and then off we go. That's the goal.
Do you need help calculating and tracking your carbon emissions? Use Zygo Activate decarbonisation software to calculate Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, track your progress, and reduce your carbon footprint. Search Zygo Activate and request your free demo today. My kind of final question really around the work is associated to actually kind of government and policy and legislation. Right. Now, whatever feelings are around certain governments is kind of irrelevant. It's more around, what is the role that government has to play in, I suppose, one, the climate crisis in general, and helping those that are, as you say, most affected and feeling the brunt of it, but are the ones that have had less to do with it in the first place in many ways. Sure. Also, from a kind of, I suppose, resilience from an infrastructure perspective, what's the role, in your opinion, that governments across the board need to be playing?
Well, sure. I mean, look, for example, in Malawi or Zambia or Tanzania, etc., I think the governments, we're working to kickstart and develop solar access markets. And those markets need a good enabling environment, essentially, good policies that, for example, preferential rates for solar to help kickstart. If you put a high tax on a solar system coming in, then it makes it even more expensive for the people you're trying to reach. Conversely, there is a history of kerosene and paraffin being subsidized. And so can we wean off any subsidies that are being provided there? Because that's like a polluting fuel and actually transfer that to greener technologies. So there's a couple, I think, as a minimum, you really want. If the private sector to flourish, it's hard enough in these deep rural areas to provide access, but you really want a stable, predictable, enabling environment and policy environment from the government. So you're not hit by any surprises. Say, oh, right, we're going to slap on a big duty on this now. And, that makes it really hard. So that's number one. I think also, I would say, look, if I was a rural farmer living in Malawi and I've just experienced a drought one year and a flood the next year, I think I have every right to be extremely angry at the rest of the world isn't, and I haven't caused this problem. It's the rest of the world. You have a right to be angry as a rural farmer, I think. Well, absolutely. And I think then that goes to the government. And I think should really, and they do, they fight their corner and say, look, our nations are struggling. We did not create this problem. And so then they have to be strong enough to fight their corner and say, right, we need support as a global community to try and address these challenges. And I think they're the two. And then I think in terms of Western governments or the global North, I think obviously they're doing what they can at a certain level, but I don't think that things are moving quickly enough. That basically transitioning to weaning us off fossil fuels, essentially. Now, I know that's challenging, but we really need to do that. Otherwise, things are only going to get worse. And they need to prioritize. This is not an expensive problem. I will just say that. The amount of money that is needed to enable everyone to have basic access to electricity across sub-Saharan Africa is not trillions. It's billions. But billions might sound a lot, but it's not. It's actually a very fixable problem. And so then what you just need is people to prioritize their policies and actually care a little bit more about the challenges that people every day are really facing, but also understanding that there are solutions. And so I suppose that, again, back to SolarAid, we're trying to develop those solutions, showcase those solutions, and then pair them up with the finance that is needed to reach scale. And so anyway, that's our theory of change in a nutshell. So a small organization can have significant change.
No, I think that's a great theory. Absolutely. That should be a great kind of North Star, in my opinion, for a lot of people and a lot of organizations. So what keeps you going? Why do you keep doing this? Right? Why 18 years on, Johnny, are you still here, still fighting for the cause?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's 18 years at SolarAid. It's actually half my life I've been doing this now. I turn 50 next year. So it is 24 years ago. I started in Tanzania as a volunteer. And I think, I was living in rural Tanzania, and I grew up in South Wales, and, I enjoyed my life, and I understood, I think, the world around me, and I had access to electricity, never really thought about it. I think we might have had one power cut. And also I'll say, I almost burned the house down with a candle once because I just lit a candle and forgot about it and went to play football, and got in a lot of trouble when I got home. Still remember that. But essentially, after living in rural Tanzania, I realized that it was a very different world that other people were surrounded in. No access to electricity, basic levels of infrastructure made life a lot harder. And that whether or not that's harder in terms of to create generate income and develop livelihoods, or to get good level education, or actually have access to healthcare. And again, personal experience. The number of times that I got sick in a deep rural area in Tanzania, this is 24 years ago, was a lot. And, I've been trained. I've been saying you've got to wash your hands, you've got to be really careful, and you can be as careful as you like. You're probably going to get quite sick at some point. And then when you get quite sick, you are out of action. I was a 25-year-old volunteer, full of energy, full of life, trying to make a change, and I'm just lying down in bed sick. And imagine that you got farmers across the continent; they're experiencing that day in, week in, year in, out. And so that's another really big challenge. That if you can increase the level of the quality of life and health access to healthcare, then you're having a huge impact on the economy as well. But what keeps me going? Well, frankly, I'd say what I was doing 24 years ago and what SolarAid was doing 18 years ago is quite different to what we're doing today. We've been on a journey. As I said at the beginning, we started with a glass cutter, and we were basically buying large solar panels, using a glass cutter to cut them up manually into smaller panels and build small frames, and then they could be used to play radios and charge and power small lights. Now, that was a very much a cottage industry sort of projects that we were working in Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia. So that's we were just making products so that they could then be distributed. So that's quite different. Obviously, we stopped that once more professional, industrialized versions of those products were started to be produced. And so then it was, okay, well, let's now focus on kickstarting solar markets and all the things you've got to learn about setting up a social enterprise, working with P&Ls and, basically working as a business. It's quite different. And doing that at scale. And then you fast track to today. Now we're really innovating to overcome failures and limitations of a marketplace. So again, the things that we're doing has changed significantly. My personal job has changed from I was a volunteer to a program manager to programs manager when we went into multiple countries. Then I became head of programs. Then I was asked to become the managing director of a social enterprise, and that was 15 years ago or so, of Sunny Money. That Sunny Money is a social enterprise that SolarAid set up. So again, learning on the job. And so over the last 18 years, been learning. Obviously now as CEO, I really am a jack of all trades. I've learned over the last 25 years of doing this, all the different aspects of working with rural communities, working with entrepreneurs, working with donors, working with investors, working with the technology, that there's never really a dull moment. But I think the other thing to say is, I'd say you'd be more likely to stop if you didn't see change happening or taking place. Yeah. But the fact is, we're very practical. Even from the first products that we used to hand make, they were making a difference as soon as people got them in their hands and playing that radio. You saw it and it was like, that's great. And it's having an immediate impact. And what we've seen, look, since the early 2000s, we estimate that 375 million solar lights and products have been sold across sub-Saharan Africa. More people today are using and lighting their homes with solar power across this continent, because I'm based in Lusaka, and across this continent than ever before. It's a huge celebration. It's huge. We're hugely proud of the role that we played in that. I am too, and that was the dream. But now we're like, right, it's not enough because we said everyone. We said we have to reach everyone, and the reason that we're doing this isn't actually per se to say, right, everyone's got a solar light or a solar powered light in their home. It was actually go right back to life is hard and poverty levels are high. And I suppose the access to electricity is being used to tackle that challenge. So this is not just a challenge of let's get a light in every home. It's actually let's work with rural communities, enable access to basic levels of electricity, and increase those levels of electricity. So actually, it's no longer a problem. Then it's everyday problems like you and I, we all kind of face. But it's not the fundamental access to electricity and basic infrastructure that is keeping us, from developing.
Yeah. And I think I might know what you're going to say to my final question, but my final question to everyone is always, in 100 years from now, when you're long gone, unfortunately, what impact do you hope that you left on the world? What's the mark that you hope you've made?
Oh, that's a tough one. Look, it's a good question and it's a good time. It is important to reflect on these things. Now, I'm not so egotistical to think, right, yeah, I made this huge change myself. I think a lot of people in their 20s, I think are idealistic and you want to change the world in some way. I think the journey I've been on it really is just to know that you've been part of something. I didn't make solar panels cheaper. I did not make lithium-based batteries so much better. I did not do anything about LEDs. All I did was really, I guess, played one role in trying to be an agent for change. And I think that's all you can really do. And I think we can play to our own strengths. I'm a very practical person. And I think once you see a challenge and you see a potentially really practical solution to that challenge, and then you just work day by day to see if you can progress that. So for me, looking back, I'm already satisfied with the choices that I've made. I've already reflected on my life. I had a significant health issue 5 years ago. Actually, celebrating 5 years in remission from blood cancer.
Amazing! That's amazing. Take your time.
Sorry, I didn't see that coming.
No, please don't be sorry. It's nothing. You have nothing to be sorry about.
No, but from this is not a theoretical question, because even 5 years ago I looked back and thought, right, well, I'm happy with the decisions I made. Sorry.
I'm going to talk a little bit over you. Apologies, but I think wow, if there's anything that puts life into perspective, it's something like that, right? And I think people have, when you go through life-changing things like that, you have a different perspective on things.
Absolutely. And so basically no regrets, right? I've spoken to other people who've been through that situation. I had the usual thing I think of, okay, what have I done with my life? What should I change? And it wasn't what I do. It was like, actually, I'm really glad I made the change to do what I do. I changed careers. I was originally a town planner. And that's great. Nothing wrong with that profession. It just wasn't for me. But I changed what I did and focused on this huge challenge. And I look back, and it was 5 years ago, and I thought, well, I'm really proud that I made that decision. And I'm not going to actually change anything. It does change what you do, or how you do things, or how you think about things, and puts things in perspective. But I was pretty proud that I was doing what I did, and kind of looked back and thought, yeah, that's great. So I think, when I'm long gone 100 years, it's the same thing. I think trying to increase access to electricity, fight poverty and the climate crisis as best as you're able, I'm pretty happy with that.
And I think one of the key pieces that I take away from you is, if every 20-year-old wanted to change the world, imagine what kind of world we would live in. And secondly, if you improve anyone's life, even just a little bit, it's worth doing, right? And ultimately, that's what you set out to do, right? Was just to improve someone's life a little bit, make it a little less of a struggle. And that's ultimately what SolarAid is doing. So, John, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for giving me your time. I've loved our conversation. And yeah, good luck for those 8,000 homes. I can see it coming next year.
Well, we're getting there, and then the rest as well. Well, thanks so much for your time, and I enjoyed the conversation.
Amazing. Thanks so much, John.
Take care.